Today, we are diving into a document that raises a disturbing question. Can a lasting peace in Europe ever be achieved when one nation's definition of existential security fundamentally requires the erasure of another's sovereign independence? Welcome to the debate. Welcome to a new Strategic Labs deep dive. Check the links in the description.
Yeah, it is a profound paradox to untangle, really. And to do so, we have to kind of ground ourselves in the rather grim reality of the present moment. I mean, we're analyzing the state of affairs as of April 2026.
Right.
And this conflict is now well into its fifth year. The data from the Council on Foreign Relations, alongside, recent reporting out of Moscow and Kyiv, it paints a staggering picture of just entrenched attrition.
It really does.
Yeah, and Russia maintains control over Crimea and significant portions of southern and eastern Ukraine. But, beyond the territorial lines, the economic recalibration is what really indicates how deep this goes. We are looking at a Russian state allocating roughly half of its entire federal budget to sustaining this war.
Half. I mean, just think about that. And on the other side of that ledger, Ukraine is staring down an estimated $588 billion in reconstruction costs.
Yeah, it's a massive number.
When I was reading the CFR report, that figure actually made me stop and reread the sentence. Because that is not just, fixing a few bridges. That is rebuilding an entire modern nation from scratch.
Right. The infrastructure.
Exactly. Demining agricultural heartlands, reconstructing shattered electrical grids, housing millions of displaced people. And doing all of this while the country is still literally on fire.
Yeah. So what we need to do today is strip away the day-to-day tactical news, the granular movements of the front line, and examine the deeply entrenched, irreconcilable foundational logics driving both sides.
Yeah, we have to look at the core of it.
Right. We have to explain exactly why this conflict remains wide open in its fifth year. So let's start with the foundational premise from the Ukrainian perspective because, well, it establishes the baseline of international law. For Kyiv, this is an unprovoked imperial aggression against a sovereign state that simply wishes to decide its own future.
Right. It's the narrative of democratic self-determination versus imperial ambition.
Exactly. The material we are analyzing shows that Kyiv fundamentally rejects the idea that its pivot toward Europe was some sort of Western conspiracy, designed to threaten Moscow. Instead, this was a democratic, sovereign choice by Ukrainian society. They sought prosperity, security, and integration with Europe, specifically to escape historical pattern of relentless Russian dominance and subordination. The concept of imperial revisionism gets thrown around a lot. But what it essentially means in this context is a reversion to 19th century rules.
Right, where the big players call the shots.
Yeah, where large empires possess an inherent right to dictate the borders, the alliances, and the domestic political systems of smaller nations. So for Ukraine, accepting Russia's framework doesn't just threaten their current borders, it destroys their very right to exist as an independent nation.
Look, the moral argument there is airtight. I mean, I get it. But from the Russian perspective, moral language kind of obscures the cold, hard geopolitical reality. Moscow isn't operating on morality.
Clearly.
Right, they are operating on geography and perceived historical vulnerability. As the diplomatic and strategic documents outline, for the Kremlin, this conflict did absolutely not start in 2022. It is the culmination of decades of post-Cold War Western expansion into what Russia perceives as its core security space.
Yeah.
We have to look at how Moscow views Ukraine. They don't merely see an independent actor making democratic choices. They see a critical, irreplaceable territory in the European balance of power.
Which, I have to point out, completely strips the agency away from the 40 million people living in that territory.
It does. It absolutely does. But that is the reality of great power security. In the Kremlin's worldview, great powers only survive if they are surrounded by a ring of subservient or at least declawed neighbors.
Right.
From Moscow's viewpoint, a fully Western-aligned Ukraine, integrated legally or de facto into hostile military structures, is a direct platform for a rival military architecture right on its most vulnerable, geographically flat border. Therefore, ensuring Ukrainian neutrality, or at least non-hostility, isn't just a diplomatic preference. It is a vital strategic necessity.
A necessity for them. Yeah.
Exactly. The historical reality is that large nuclear-armed states simply do not passively accept the erosion of what they consider their strategic buffer zones.
Well, that's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently, because this obsession with the buffer zone is fundamentally flawed in its execution.
How so?
It's like trying to build a fire break to stop a forest fire, but you're burning down your neighbor's house to do it, and the wind is blowing the sparks right back into your own yard. You don't secure your borders by launching an invasion that turns your neighbor into a permanent, highly militarized adversary.
Well, that leads directly into how Russia justifies this to its own people, actually, because they don't see it as turning a neighbor into an adversary. They see it as confronting an adversary that had already taken over the neighbor.
The proxy arguments.
Right. From the Russian perspective, Ukraine is functioning as the military and political arm of the West. If you look at the recent disbursements, the European Union is currently preparing massive new financial packages for 2026 and 2027 just to keep the Ukrainian state afloat.
Which is necessary for their survival.
True, but when a nation requires hundreds of billions of dollars from external blocs to maintain its basic state functions, to pay its civil servants, to fund its pensions, let alone conduct military operations, Moscow looks at that and concludes the autonomy is an illusion.
So they view it as a proxy theater.
Exactly. And understanding that mechanism is crucial to understanding how a state sustains a 50% federal war budget without collapsing into immediate domestic revolt. The Kremlin has successfully framed this for its population not as an aggressive war against a weaker neighbor, but as a defensive war for civilizational continuity against the combined economic and industrial might of the West.
Right, fighting the West on Ukrainian soil.
Yeah, they are fighting the West on Ukrainian soil. That core logic is what makes the immense domestic costs palatable to the Russian public.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on the mechanics of that dependency. Because the proxy war narrative fundamentally misrepresents the aggressor-victim dynamic. Asking for weapons and financial aid to survive an invasion does not negate your sovereignty.
It complicates it.
It complicates it, sure. But consider this analogy. If a homeowner experiences a violent home invasion and calls the police for a weapon or for backup, you don't suddenly call the homeowner a puppet of the police. Ukraine is receiving aid because it was attacked, not the other way around.
But the scale of the reliance.
The scale is dictated by the size of the aggressor, which leads me to a critical question for the Russian perspective. If Ukraine is merely a proxy, a hollow puppet for Western interests, how do we account for the immense, sustained social will to resist?
Well, they would argue that.
Just hear me out on this. A top-down proxy operation shatters under the kind of pressure Ukraine has faced. Doesn't the fact that the Ukrainian people are willing to endure a targeted, multi-year campaign against their civilian infrastructure, millions freezing in the dark during the winters, local volunteers continuously rebuilding shattered electrical grids while under fire, prove that this is an organic, deeply rooted fight for national survival?
That's a compelling argument, definitely. But have you considered how Russia interprets that very resistance? The Russian framework doesn't deny that Ukrainians are fighting hard. It categorizes that resistance as the product of over a decade of Western militarization and an anti-Russian ideological project that has taken root in Kyiv.
So they dismiss the agency again?
Essentially, yes, but let's look at how this ideological deadlock translates to the physical realities on the ground in 2026. Because that financial lifeline you mentioned, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's being spent to hold physical ground.
And the ground war has become agonizingly slow.
Agonizingly slow, but still moving. The Russian state operates on strict military doctrine, and recent figures out of Moscow claim they have taken roughly 1,700 square kilometers this year alone.
Right, though obviously pro-Ukrainian sources dispute those exact figures.
Sure, they dispute it, but the strategic intent is what matters here. Just look at the recent statements from the chief of the Russian General Staff, Valery Gerasimov. He explicitly justified the new offensives in border regions like Sumy and Kharkiv as the necessary creation of a, quote, security zone.
A security zone?
Yeah. For Russia, taking territory isn't just about painting the map red. It's a doctrinal instrument. You physically push the threat, the artillery, the drones, the Western-supplied missiles, further away from your borders. It's a spatial solution to a strategic problem.
Well, I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning at all.
because the contradiction in that security logic is glaringly obvious, and the data bears this out entirely. Russia claims it invaded to push threats away and secure its borders. Yet, this very invasion has directly resulted in unprecedented Ukrainian strikes deep into Russian sovereign territory.
Yeah, the drone campaign.
Exactly. We are seeing sustained, highly asymmetric hits on Russian ports, oil refineries, and logistics hubs. Ukraine is using relatively cheap, domestically produced drones to bypass million-dollar air defense systems, and they are actively damaging Russian hydrocarbon production and export capabilities.
They are definitely feeling the economic sting of those strikes, I'll grant you that.
It's more than a sting, though. The invasion literally created the exact vulnerability it supposedly sought to prevent. It brought the war into the Russian economic heartland. Furthermore, calling occupied regions like Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson security zones, or citing the protection of Russian speakers, it is transparently an attempt to legitimize the permanent annexation of sovereign land. It is empire building dressed up as border security.
Well, I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that.
Why not?
Let me tell you why that interpretation misses the Kremlin's internal calculus. Yes, there are strikes on Russian refineries. Yes, there is economic blowback and humiliation when a drone hits a facility hundreds of miles inside Russia. But you have to understand the hierarchy of threats in the Russian strategic mindset.
Okay.
It's like a chess player willingly sacrificing a rook to protect the king. A drone strike on an oil refinery is a tactical pain. It costs money and it's embarrassing. But a fully integrated, NATO-aligned Ukraine sharing a massive border with the Russian heartland is viewed as an existential terminal threat to the Russian state.
So they just accept the daily bleeding to prevent the theoretical decapitation.
Precisely. They are willing to trade short-term economic damage and tactical vulnerability to prevent what they see as a strategic checkmate. And the integration of those territories, which Moscow officially claims as irreversibly Russian now, it serves multiple purposes. It secures strategic corridors, like the vital land bridge to Crimea.
Right.
And it absorbs populations and industrial capacity that Russia views as historically part of its civilizational sphere. It's not just a land grab in their eyes. It's a reordering of the map to reflect what they believe is the natural geopolitical equilibrium.
But that equilibrium is entirely reliant on perpetual coercion. And this brings us to the ultimate question of how either side envisions an end to this. From the Ukrainian perspective, yielding to exhaustion, giving up territory in exchange for a pause in the violence, does not bring peace. It simply invites future aggression.
That's the fear in Kyiv, yeah.
It is. The source material highlights a profound lesson Ukraine has learned over the past decade. Vague neutrality and ambiguous international status leave them as a permanent target. Consequently, Ukraine's position is that any resolution must include hard, long-term security guarantees, justice, and accountability for the destruction caused.
Which Moscow will never willingly grant.
Exactly. But for Ukraine, a bad peace that freezes the conflict along the current lines of control and rewards the aggressor is viewed as an existential threat not just to themselves, but to the global order. It would signal not just to Russia, but to the world that borders can be redrawn by force, that the UN Charter is just a suggestion. Ukraine is fighting to ensure that international law matters more than brute force, because if it doesn't, small nations everywhere are no longer safe.
I come at it from a different way, because the Russian endgame is built on a completely different foundation of risk assessment. The Kremlin fundamentally believes that accepting a strategic defeat in Ukraine, which includes accepting those hard Western security guarantees for Kiev that you just mentioned, is an existential threat to Russia's status as a great power.
So it's zero-sum for them.
Completely zero-sum. They are perfectly willing to absorb devastating economic isolation, deep domestic strain, and prolonged conflict because they believe the alternative is fatal to their statehood. A hostile, heavily armed Western frontier and a loss of global prestige is viewed as far worse than a forever war.
They would rather rule over the ashes than admit defeat.
In a sense, yes. This isn't just a war of attrition on the battlefield anymore. It's a race to see which collapses first. Is it Russian socioeconomic stability under Western isolation and a 50% war budget? Or is it Ukrainian demographic viability under relentless bombardment and structural destruction?
Yeah.
which actually raises a profound question for the Ukrainian strategy. Given the massive demographic exhaustion and the sheer material toll required to uphold absolute territorial integrity, is Ukraine's maximalist position sustainable without indefinite and frankly vulnerable reliance on the shifting political winds of the West?
That is the question.
Right, because if the EU or the US alter their disbursement schedules for 2026 or 2027 due to their own domestic politics, does the sovereignty argument survive the material shortfall?
That is the harrowing dilemma at the heart of Ukraine's reality. The defense of absolute principles of sovereignty requires very tangible, immense material support. Ideals don't intercept ballistic missiles. Patriot batteries do.
Exactly.
But to summarize the gulf between these two positions, at its core, Ukraine is fighting to prove that international law, self-determination, and state sovereignty are real, binding concepts that must outlast brute force. For Kyiv, giving into the Russian logic means sacrificing its future as an independent nation, essentially agreeing to be a vassal state simply because the neighbor is heavily armed. They cannot accept a peace that merely hits pause on their eventual erasure.
In summarizing the Russian posture, they are fighting to force a total renegotiation of the European security architecture. The Kremlin is convinced that its survival as an independent great power requires reordering its sphere of influence, regardless of the economic, diplomatic, or human cost. They view the post-Cold War expansion of Western alliances as an existential encroachment, and they are using military force to draw a hard physical line in the sand, daring the West to cross it.
Which brings us to one terrifying point of convergence in this analysis. Neither side views this as a simple border dispute.
No, not at all.
Neither side is fighting over a mere adjustment of coordinates on a map. Both view the outcome as fundamentally existential. Ukraine believes it ceases to exist if it loses. Russia believes it ceases to be a great power if it fails.
Exactly. And that shared perception of existential stakes is precisely what explains the sheer intractability of the conflict as we look at it in its fifth year. When survival is on the table, compromise is almost always viewed as suicide.
Right.
There's so much more complexity in the source material to explore, particularly regarding how these dueling narratives are deployed to shape the internal politics and, really, the remarkable social resilience of both nations.
We started today by asking if peace is possible when one nation's security requires the erasure of another's independence. The evidence suggests that as long as those foundational logics remain entrenched, the muddy waters of this conflict will only deepen. We've reached the end of this analysis. If this added value, please like and subscribe to Strategic Labs. See you next time.